For a long time Claudia merely stood there. Blood had soaked the carpet, darkening the woven wreaths of flowers. It gleamed sticky and black on the floorboards. It stained her dress, her white shoes, her cheek. She wiped at it with a crumpled napkin, took a swipe at the impossible stains of the dress, and then she said, "Louis, you must help me get him out of here." I said no. I turned my back on her, on the corpse at her feet. "Are you mad, Louis? It can't remain here," she said to me. "And the boys. You must help me. The other one's dead from the absinthe, Louis." I knew that this was true, necessary, and yet it seemed impossible. She had to prod me then, almost lead me every step of the way. We found the kitchen stove still heaped with the bones of the mother and daughter she'd killed. A dangerous blunder, a stupidity. So she scraped them out now into a sack and dragged the sack across the courtyard stones to the carriage. I hitched the horse myself, shushing the groggy coachman, and drove the hearse out of the city, fast in the direction of the Bayou Saint-Jean, towards the dark swamp that stretched to Lake Pontchartrain. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. She sat beside me, silent, as we rode on until we'd passed the gaslit gates of the few country houses, and the shell road narrowed and became rutted, the swamp rising on either side of us, a great wall of seemingly impenetrable cypress and vine. I could smell the stench of the muck, hear the rustling of the animals. Claudia had wrapped Lestat's body in a sheet before I would even touch it, and then, to my horror, she had sprinkled it over with the long-stemmed chrysanthemums, so it had a sweet funeral smell as I lifted it last of all from the carriage. It was almost weightless, as limp as something made of knots and cords, as I put it over my shoulder and moved down into the dark water, the water rising and filling my boots, my feet sinking some path in the ooze beneath. My feet seeking some path in the ooze beneath, away from where I'd laid the two boys. I went deeper and deeper in with Lestat's remains, though why I did not know, and finally, when I could barely see the pale space of the road and the sky which was coming dangerously close to dawn, I let his body slip out of my arms into the water. I stood there shaken, looking at the amorphous form of the white sheet beneath the slimy surface. The numbness which had protected me since the carriage left the Rue Royale threatened to lift and leave me flayed suddenly, staring, thinking, "This is Lestat. This is all of transformation and mystery, dead, gone into eternal darkness." I felt a pull suddenly, as if some force were urging me to go down with him, to descend into the dark water and never come back. It was so distinct and so strong that it made the articulation of voices seem only a murmur by comparison. It spoke without language, saying, "You know what you must do. Come down into the darkness. Let it all go away." But at that moment I heard Claudia's voice. She was calling my name. I turned, and through the tangled vines I saw her distant and tiny, like a white flame on the faint luminescent shell road. That morning she wound her arms around me, pressed her head against my chest in the closeness of the coffin, whispering she loved me, that we were free of Lestat forever. "I love you, Louis," she said over and over as the darkness finally came down with the lid and mercifully blotted out all consciousness. When I awoke, she was going through his things. It was a tirade, silent, controlled, but filled with a fierce anger. She pulled the contents from the cabinets, emptied drawers onto the carpets, pulled one jacket after another from his armoires, turning the pockets inside out, throwing the coins and theatre tickets and bits and pieces of paper away. I stood in the door of his room, astonished, watching her. His coffin lay there, heaped with scarves and pieces of tapestry. I had the compulsion to open it. I had the wish to see him there. Nothing, she finally said in disgust. She wadded the clothes into the grate. Not a hint of where he came from. Who made him? She said. Not a scrap. She looked at me as if for sympathy. I turned away from her. I was unable to look at her. I moved back into that bedroom which I kept for myself, that room filled with my own books and what things I'd saved from my mother and sister, and I sat on the bed. I could hear her at the door, but I would not look at her. He deserved to die, she said to me. Then we deserve to die, the same way, every night of our lives, I said back to her. Go away from me. It was as if the words were my thoughts, my mind alone only formless confusion. I'll care for you because you can't care for yourself, but I don't want you near me. Sleep in that box you bought for yourself. Don't come near me. I told you I was going to do it. I told you, she said. Never had her voice sounded so fragile, so like a little silvery bell. I looked up at her, startled but unshaken. Her face seemed not her face. Never had anyone shaped such agitation into the features of a doll. Louis, I told you, she said, her lips quivering. I did it for us, so we could be free. I couldn't stand the sight of her, her beauty, her seeming innocence, and this terrible agitation. I went past her, perhaps knocking her backwards, I don't know, and I was almost to the railing of the steps when I heard a strange sound. Never in all the years of our lives together had I heard this sound. Never since that night long ago when I first found her, a mortal child, clinging to her mother. She was crying. It drew me back now against my will, yet it sounded so unconscious, so hopeless, as though she meant no one to hear it, or didn't care if it were heard by the whole world. I found her lying on my bed in the place where I often sat to read, her knees drawn up, her whole frame shaking with her sobs. The sound of it was terrible. It was more heartfelt, more awful than her mortal crying had ever been. I sat down slowly, gently beside her, and put my hand on her shoulder. She lifted her head, startled, her eyes wide, her mouth trembling. Her face was stained with tears, tears that were tinted with blood. Her eyes brimmed with them, and the faint touch of red stained her tiny hand. She didn't seem to be conscious of this, to see it. She pushed her hair back from her forehead. Her body quivered then with a long, low, pleading sob. Louis, if I lose you, I have nothing, she whispered. I would undo it to have you back. I can't undo what I've done. She put her arms around me, climbing up against me, sobbing against my heart. My hands were reluctant to touch her, and then they moved as if I couldn't stop them, to enfold her and hold her and stroke her hair. I can't live without you, she whispered. I would rather die than live without you. I would die the same way he died. I can't bear you to look at me the way you did. I cannot bear it if you do not love me. Her sobs grew worse, more bitter, until finally I bent and kissed her soft neck and cheeks, winter plums, plums from an enchanted wood where the fruit never falls from the boughs, where the flowers never wither and die. All right, my dear, I said to her. All right, my love. And I rocked her slowly, gently in my arms until she dozed, murmuring something about our being eternally happy, free of Lestat forever, beginning the great adventure of our lives. The great adventure of our lives. What does it mean to die when you can live until the end of the world? And what is the end of the world except a phrase? Because who knows even what is the world itself? I had now lived in 2 centuries, seen the illusions of one utterly shattered by the other, been eternally young and eternally ancient, possessing no illusions, living moment to moment in a way that made me picture a silver clock ticking in a void, The painted face, the delicately carved hands looked upon by no one, looking out at no one, illuminated by a light which was not a light, like the light by which God made the world before he had made light. Ticking, 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 the precision of the clock in a room as vast as the universe. I was walking the streets again, Claudia gone her way to kill, the perfume of her hair and dress lingering on my fingertips, on my coat, my eyes moving far ahead of me like the pale beam of a lantern. I found myself at the cathedral. What does it mean to die when you can live until the end of the world? I was thinking of my brother's death, of the incense and the rosary. I had the desire suddenly to be in that funeral room, listening to the sound of the women's voices rising and falling with the Aves, the clicking of the beads, the smell of the wax. I could remember the crying. It was palpable, as if it were just yesterday, just behind a door. I saw myself walking fast down a corridor and gently giving the door a shove. The great facade of the cathedral rose in a dark mass opposite the square, but the doors were open, and I could see a soft, flickering light within. It was Saturday evening early, and the people were going to confession for Sunday Mass and communion. Candles burned dim in the chandeliers. At the far end of the nave the altar loomed out of the shadows, laden with white flowers. It was to the old church on this spot that they had brought my brother for the final service before the cemetery, and I realized suddenly that I hadn't been in this place since. Never once come up the stone steps, crossed the porch, and passed through the open doors. I had no fear. If anything, perhaps I longed for something to happen, for the stones to tremble as I entered the shadowy foyer and saw the distant tabernacle on the altar. I remembered now that I had passed here once when the windows were ablaze and the sounds of singing poured out onto Jackson Square. I had hesitated then, wondering if there were some secret Lestat had never told me, something which might destroy me if I were to enter. I had felt compelled to enter, but I had pushed this out of my mind, breaking loose from the fascination of the open doors, the throng of people making one voice. I had something for Claudia, a doll I was taking to her, a bridal doll I'd lifted from a darkened toy shop window and placed in a great box with ribbons and tissue paper. A doll for Claudia. I remembered pressing on with it, hearing the heavy vibrations of the organ behind me, my eyes narrow with the great blaze of the candles. Now I thought of that moment, that fear in me at the very sight of the altar, the sound of the Pange Lingua, and I thought again, persistently, of my brother. I could see the coffin rolling along up the center aisle, the procession of mourners behind it. I felt no fear now. As I said, I think if anything I felt a longing for some fear, for some reason for fear as I moved slowly along the dark stone walls. The air was chill and damp in spite of summer. The thought of Claudia's doll came back to me. Where was that doll? For years Claudia had played with that doll. Suddenly I saw myself searching for the doll, in the relentless and meaningless manner one searches for something in a nightmare, coming on doors that won't open or drawers that won't shut, struggling over and over against the same meaningless thing, not knowing why the effort seems so desperate, why the sudden sight of a chair with a shawl thrown over it inspires the mind with horror. I was in the cathedral. A woman stepped out of the confessional and passed the long line of those who waited. A man who should have stepped up next did not move, and my eye, sensitive even in my vulnerable condition, noted this, and I turned to see him. He was staring at me. Quickly I turned my back on him. I heard him enter the confessional and shut the door. I walked up the aisle of the church and then, more from exhaustion than from any conviction, went into an empty pew and sat down. I had almost genuflected from old habit. My mind seemed as muddled and tortured as that of any human. I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to banish all thoughts. Hear and see, I said to myself, and with this act of will, my senses emerged from the torment. All around me in the gloom I heard the whisper of prayers, the tiny click of the rosary beads, soft the sighing of the woman who knelt now at the 12th station. Sighing of the woman who knelt now at the 12th station. Rising from the sea of wooden pews came the scent of rats. A rat moving somewhere near the altar. A rat in the great wood-carved side altar of the Virgin Mary. The gold candlesticks shimmering on the altar. A rich white chrysanthemum bent suddenly on its stem, droplets glistening on the crowded petals, a sour fragrance rising from a score of vases. From altars and side altars, the statues of virgins and Christs and saints. I stared at the statues. I became obsessed suddenly and completely with the lifeless profiles, the staring eyes, the empty hands, the frozen folds. Then my body convulsed with such violence that I found myself pitched forward, my hand on the pew before me. It was a cemetery of dead forms, of funeral effigy and stone angels. I looked up and saw myself in a most palpable vision, ascending the altar steps, opening the tiny sacrosanct tabernacle, reaching with monstrous hands for the consecrated ciborium, and taking the body of Christ and strewing its white wafers all over the carpet, and walking then on the sacred wafers, walking up and down before the altar, giving Holy Communion to the dust. I rose up now in the pew and stood there staring at this vision. I knew full well the meaning of it. God did not live in this church. These statues gave an image to nothingness. I was the supernatural in this cathedral. I was the only supernatural thing that stood conscious under this roof. Loneliness. Loneliness to the point of madness. The cathedral crumbled in my vision. The saints listed and fell. Rats ate the Holy Eucharist and nested on the sills. A solitary rat with an enormous tail stood tugging and gnawing at the rotted altar cloth until the candlesticks fell and rolled on the slime-covered stones. And I remained standing, untouched, undead, reaching out suddenly for the plaster hand of the Virgin and seeing it break in my hand, so that I held the hand crumbling in my palm, the pressure of my thumb turning it to powder. And then suddenly, through the ruins, up through the open door, through which I could see a wasteland in all directions, even the great river frozen over and stuck with the encrusted ruins of ships. Up through these ruins now came a funeral procession, a band of pale white men and women, monsters with gleaming eyes and flowing black clothes, the coffin rumbling on the wooden wheels, the rats scurrying across the broken and buckling marble, the procession advancing, so that I could see then Claudia in the procession, her eyes staring from behind a thin black veil, one gloved hand locked upon a black prayer book, the other on the coffin as it moved past her. And there now in the coffin, beneath a glass cover, I saw to my horror the skeleton of Lestat, the wrinkled skin now pressed into the very texture of his bones, his eyes but sockets, his blonde hair billowed on the white satin. The procession stopped. The mourners moved out, filling the dusty pews without a sound, and Claudia, turning with her book, opened it and lifted the veil back from her face, her eyes fixed on me as her finger touched the page. "And now thou art cursed. And now art thou cursed from the earth," she whispered, her whisper rising in echo in the ruins. "And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth, and whoever slayeth thee, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." I shouted at her. I screamed, the scream rising up out of the depths of my being like some great rolling black force that broke from my lips and sent my body reeling against my will. A terrible sighing rose from the mourners, a chorus growing louder and louder as I turned to see them all about me, pushing me into the aisle against the very sides of the coffin, so that I turned to get my balance and found both my hands upon it. And I stood there staring down not at the remains of Lestat, but at the body of my mortal brother. A quiet descended, as if the veil had fallen all over and made their forms dissolve beneath its soundless folds. There was my brother, blond and young and sweet as he had been in life, as real and warm to me now as he'd been years and years before, and I could never have remembered him thus. So perfectly was he recreated, so perfectly in every detail. His blonde hair brushed back from his forehead, his eyes closed as if he slept, his smooth fingers around the crucifix on his breast, his lips so pink and silken I could hardly bear to see them and not touch them. And as I reached out just to touch the softness of his skin, the vision ended. I was sitting still in the Saturday night cathedral, the smell of the tapers thick in the motionless air, the woman of the stations gone, and darkness gathering behind me, across me, and now above me. A boy appeared in the black cassock of a lay brother, with a long extinguisher on a golden pole, putting its little funnel down upon one candle, and then another, and then another. I was stupefied. He glanced at me and then away, as if not to disturb a man deep in prayer. And then, as he moved on up to the next chandelier, I felt a hand on my shoulder. That two humans should pass this close to me without my hearing, without my even caring, registered somewhere within me that I was in danger. But I did not care. I looked up now and saw a grey-haired priest. "You wish to go to confession?" he asked. I was about to lock up the church. He narrowed his eyes behind his thick glasses. The only light now came from the racks of little red glass candles which burned before the saints, and shadows leaped upon the towering walls. "You are troubled, aren't you? Can I help you?" "It's too late. Too late," I whispered to him, and rose to go. He backed away from me, still apparently unaware of anything about my appearance that should alarm him, and said kindly to reassure me, "No, it's still early. Do you want to come into confessional?" For a moment I just stared at him. I was tempted to smile, and then it occurred to me to do it. But even as I followed him down the aisle, in the shadows of the vestibule, I knew that this would be nothing, that it was madness. Nevertheless, I knelt down in the small wooden booth, my hands folded on the prie-dieu as he sat on the booth beside me and slid back the panel to show me the dim outline of his profile. I stared at him for a moment, and then I said it, lifting my hand to make the sign of the cross. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned so often and so long, I do not know how to change, nor how to confess before God what I have done." "Son, God is infinite in his capacity to forgive," he whispered to me. "Tell him in the best way you know how, and from your heart." Murders, Father, death after death. The woman who died 2 nights ago in Jackson Square. I killed her, and thousands of others before her, 1 and 2 a night, Father, for 70 years. I have walked the streets of New Orleans like the Grim Reaper, and fed on human life for my own existence. I am not mortal, Father, but immortal and damned, like angels put in hell by God. I am a vampire. The priest turned. "What is this? Some sort of sport for you? Some joke? You take advantage of an old man," he said. He slid the wooden panel back with a splat. Quickly I opened the door and stepped out to see him standing there. "Young man, do you fear God at all? Do you know the meaning of sacrilege?" He glared at me. Now I moved closer to him, slowly, very slowly, and at first he merely stared at me, outraged. Then, confused, he took a step back. The church was hollow, empty, black, the sacristan gone, and the candles throwing ghastly light only on the distant altars. They made a wreath of soft gold fivers about his grey head and face. "Then there is no mercy," I said to him, and suddenly clamping my hands on his shoulders, I held him in a preternatural lock from which he couldn't hope to move, and held him close beneath my face. His mouth fell open in horror. "Do you see what I am? Why, if God exists, does he suffer me to exist?" I said to him. "You talk of sacrilege!" He dug his nails into my hands, trying to free himself, his misel dropping to the floor, his rosary clattering in the folds of his cassock. He might as well have fought the animated statues of the saints. I drew my lips back and showed him my virulent teeth. "Why does he suffer me to live?" I said. His face infuriated me, his fear, his contempt, his rage. I saw in it all the hatred I'd seen in Babette, and he hissed at me, "Let me go, devil!" in sheer mortal panic. I released him, watching with a sinister fascination as he floundered, moving up the centre aisle as if he ploughed through snow, and then I was after him, so swift that I surrounded him in an instant with my outstretched arms, my cape throwing him into darkness, his legs scrambling still. He was cursing me, calling on God at the altar, and then I grabbed him on the very steps of the communion rail and pulled him down to my face and sank my teeth into his neck. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. What a great section that is. I have to say, we're getting to the point in the novel where it really, really comes into its own. There were some shaky bits towards the start where I was like, is this book really as good as I remember it being? But now we're into this section. Oh, it's great. It's pure, unadulterated existential angst, and it is wonderful. So, a few mispronunciations in that segment, more than usual, which I apologize for, but it comes with the territory of this kind of off-the-cuff recording. Regardless, what are some of the cool things that happened today? Well, there's one big thing to talk about, but there's one minor thing to get through first, and that is the fact that Claudia and Louis have a fight. They have a falling out, which inspires Louis to basically go off and visit this cathedral. An interesting thing I want to talk about in this regard is, of course, you could take on the face this notion of Claudia crying and invoking all these emotional terms towards Louis as a genuine display from Claudia. I think that's a valid reading. But thus far, I've been going with this reading of Claudia as being much more detached from Louis and much more manipulative, effectively, in order to preserve her own life. So kind of tolerating his creepy affections in order to preserve herself. And I think that looking at that in this regard, Claudia's crying and emotional statements are really interesting. The first thing to note is that Claudia is still in control, no matter how angry Louis is at her. Even though he says that he's upset at her for killing Lestat, he never even questions continuing to serve her. He concludes that he's still going to bring her to Europe. He's still going to help her deal with these situations. He's not questioning his loyalty, regardless. However, obviously, it is an inconvenient situation to be in. It very much works better for Claudia for him to be fully emotionally on board with his servitude. And so, I think it's an interesting possibility that Claudia basically realizes that this is another way, or one of the prime ways that she can reaffirm Louis's affections for her. And they certainly work by crying and talking about loving him and, holding him, that kind of thing. It does bring him entirely back on board. By the end of that segment, he is entirely reaffirmed in his at least outward affection for Claudia. We'll see what he thinks internally as the story progresses, but he's definitely more on board than he was at the beginning, and Claudia's security in his servitude is guaranteed. Something interesting I was noticing in that language that was being used, and it is a very tenuous connection that kind of works with something I'm going to bring up a little bit later today. But keep in mind this is very tenuous, is the parallel of the kind of language and motives of Claudia in this context with the language and motives of the character of Eve in Paradise Lost. The main thing that got me thinking in this regard was when Claudia talks about this notion of she would rather die than make Louis suffer. It's reminiscent of after Eve has eaten the apple and goes to talk to Adam. She says that she would rather face her death individually than make Adam also face it himself. And she says this as a motivator to get Adam on her side and to also eat the apple. Because of course, prior to that, she has revealed in soliloquy that she in fact is going to attempt to get Adam to eat the apple as well in order to make it so that she is not alone in her fate. So that she is not the only one who suffers in this regard, and she still has him. So effectively, she is, using this statement that she would rather die as a lie, a manipulation, in order to increase the affections of Adam. Which, if we take it in that kind of mirrored context, it's kind of reminiscent here in the way Claudia talks to Louis, where she says, I would rather die, I would rather undo all of this than make you suffer as I am. But the problem is, of course, that it's already done, and it's very clear from the language she uses before and after this that she doesn't actually regret it, and she's quite happy to be free of Lestat's influence. That it's more of a manipulative terminology. It's a very tenuous observation regarding Paradise Lost, but I think it's interesting and it kind of ties into something I'm going to talk about in a bit. So, the main thing to talk about in this section, and it is a big one, so this might be a longer episode than usual, is, you remember earlier when I mentioned that there is this theme of loss of faith throughout the entire novel, and I said there was a better scene to talk about in regards. I was referring to this scene. There are still going to be moments where I talk about it in the future, but this is where I'm going to try and address some of the core ideas that's going on here. So, interesting things to talk about in regards to this cathedral that Louis visits. The first is that the cathedral is depicted in the text across multiple time periods. Louis remembers it as it was in the past when he visited there with his brother. He sees a fictionalized version of it in a vision, and he is, of course, existing within it in the present, in the context of the story. What I think this emphasizes is pretty clear. This presents a vision of these religious beliefs and religious institutions as a timeless concept. And indeed, while we have Louis within that cathedral, he is constantly watched over by images of the saints, Jesus and the Virgin Mary, all of them kind of looming over him in an almost menacing manner in the way that they are described. Furthermore, the priest, when the priest observes Louis, he doesn't react in horror or reluctance as any other character thus far would have, which presents, because obviously he has a vampiric visage and he's under candlelight, which You can argue that they can't quite see him, but I think the main thing this shows is that the priest has a genuine desire to help within him. The priest is not just phoning in his desire to help, he is genuinely interested in helping Louis. However, it's not all a rosy depiction of these institutions, because the cathedral is quite literally infested with rats. Louis observes them in various different sections of the building, and this is a very, very clear metaphor for there being something wrong at the very core of this institution. There being something flawed with the very concept that institution represents. And as we go on, I think we'll see that that problem appears to be the non-existence of God. The institution is in place, but it is not backed up by the existence of God in Louis's mind, and therefore it is flawed beyond belief. Quite literally, I suppose. An ironic thing that occurs within this section is that Louis has a vision, which is ironic because it occurs in a scene that relates to a loss of faith and a suggestion of the non-existence of God. So I suppose this vision is implied to occur entirely within his imagination, I guess. Louis pictures these concepts, he imagines these things while he is sitting in the church, which is kind of a secular manifestation of the visions that would typically be associated with religious miracles. He kind of has an inverse miracle. Instead of having a vision which brings him closer to God, he has a vision which brings him away from this concept of a non-existent God. And it suggests, basically, that all of these visions which may have occurred religiously are in the same way that Louis's brother might have been, just all in their heads, essentially. All visions are imagination to this text, I think. An interesting thing in this vision is that obviously Claudia features in this vision. And Claudia reads a passage from the Bible, and the passage is in reference to the punishment of Cain by God. You're probably familiar. Cain, of course, is the first murderer, biblically. He murdered his brother Abel, and in doing so was punished by God. This passage appears to be directed directly at Louis in this regard. And its implications are somewhat clear on the surface, because Cain was the first murderer, and Louis is now implicit in a murder, a plotted murder in the form of Lestat, but he is also a murderer in the sense that he has killed thousands of people at this stage, I imagine. So the reading of this passage directed at him is a manifestation of his guilt at the sin of murder, the murder of Lestat, but also the guilt at the death of his brother, because, of course, once Louis looks into the coffin, he sees that the figure of Lestat has been replaced by the figure of his dead brother, who he once saw buried in this same, well, not buried, but there's a better word for it, but who he once attended the funeral of in this very same cathedral. And of course Louis, as we remember, blamed himself a great deal for the death of his brother. And that blame came directly as a result of his lack of ability to believe in God or believe in miracles. He was unable to believe his brother's spiritual experience, and as such, he believes that he caused his brother's death. An interesting thing also, I should clarify then, that essentially what this appears to imply is that Louis is Louis's guilt that is represented in this vision, Louis's central conflict in this vision, kind of comes down to this guilt at his own ability to believe in God and to believe in moral structure. Because it is interesting that Cain is used in this regard also. Because Cain, of course, first murder applies in this regard. But a core aspect to the punishment of Cain, as I understand it, I may be corrected on this if I'm not wrong, I should look this up, but just talking off the top of my head, is that Cain is unrepentant for his actions. He does not see what he has done wrong, functionally. He says the iconic line, "Am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible for his action, for what my brother does?" Or for looking after my brother, when God asks him where his brother is, knowing already, of course, that he has murdered him. And it is this dissuaging of responsibility, this dissuaging of moral culpability, that Louis is also guilty of. Louis parallels Cain in his sin of murder, but he also parallels Cain in the fact that he is unwilling to accept responsibility for those murders which he has committed every day. Well, every night, I should clarify. So that's really cool and really, really interesting. And I love that section. However, there's more to talk about because Louis inevitably goes into confession. And he, I suppose tangentially, attempts to claim this responsibility. I think it kind of hits him very close to home. I think he realizes that he is guilty of all these horrible crimes, and he goes into the confessional with the priest and tells him his sins. So he's attempting to, in some way, account for the sins he's committed. But the priest does not take Louis's claim seriously. Now, the first thing I should clarify before I go to talk on about this any further is that the priest not taking him seriously is a pretty reasonable response, I think. Louis kind of just springs it all on him at once, and he then gets very confused as to why the priest doesn't really believe him when he's making these very, very outrageous claims without any form of evidence. And then he gets very, very mad at the priest for not immediately believing him. I think Louis could have handled it a lot better. But he was under a lot of stress, he was having an emotional conflict, and in truth, I think Louis has already decided what he's going to do at the moment of entering the confessional. He is he's just going through the motions of this attempt at confession in order to reaffirm to himself the non-existence of God. I don't think he actually wants, to be culpable for his actions. What's interesting is that the priest's refusal to believe that Louis is a vampire directly contradicts one of Louis's earlier beliefs, where he mentions that people are far more willing to believe in evil than they are willing to believe in good. It seems instead to be the case that people are just unwilling to believe in the supernatural altogether, even when supposedly confronted directly by it. There's a few things to suggest in this. Perhaps it's a manifestation of the change in era that has occurred in the vast period of time that has passed since Louis became a vampire. I think it's also just a manifestation of the fact that whilst people may hold superstition dear to them, they are just not willing to accept actual existence of that superstition, unless it runs up and punches them directly in the face. And so that's worth mentioning. Again, I think Louis could really have handled his confrontation of the priest a lot better if he was actually interested in contrition, but I'm inclined to believe he wasn't actually that interested in contrition, which we'll get on to now. So after the priest scolds Louis and talks about divine judgment to him and gets quite annoyed at him, Louis goes on his big rampage and rant towards the priest, in which we get to bring back Paradise Lost again. Because Louis, once again, and much more tangibly this time, is reminiscent of Adam in Paradise Lost, where he goes on this great tirade about, why do I exist? I didn't ask to be born. I am... why have I been made as I am? I didn't want this. It's not right. And from this, he just concludes the non-existence of God. Because if God existed, it would only be right that God would be able to intervene and perhaps prevent his being turned into a vampire, or at the very least offer some tangible affirmation of his existence within this cathedral of all places. And once this lack of response is affirmed, he essentially metaphorically kills his belief through the literal killing of the priest. In slaying the priest, he represents a slaying of his own belief in the divine and divine judgment. And essentially, what he concludes is the exact opposite of what Adam concludes, where Adam kind of, goes about, why do I exist? I didn't ask to be created. And then he concludes, well, it doesn't matter that I didn't ask. I'm still responsible for my actions, essentially, and I have to face the consequences of them. Louis concludes that because there is no God and no grander purpose to existence, then essentially there is no grander purpose to the universe. He experiences this vast loneliness, and this, it appears, reaffirms the lack of moral structure and makes it okay for him to continue doing whatever he wants. Essentially, Louis realizes that morality doesn't exist, that there is no God, the universe doesn't care about him, and this, in his angst, just reaffirms his current course of action and his current descent into inhumanity. I think this is the big turning point for Louis. I think with this complete rejection of moral structure as represented within the church, this is the moment where Louis falls off the deep end. He's in the death spiral now, and he's just going to keep losing his morality inch by inch until there's nothing left. One of my favorite scenes in the book. Absolutely love it. This is a really long episode. I apologize to that, but I hope you've enjoyed that. And it keeps being good from here on out. This book is really, really good. So I will see you again tomorrow for some more of Interview with the Vampire. Take care.